If I were a different man, I would have married you already. Salvatore Moretti, 65 years old, a former Mafia boss who once made all of Chicago tremble, now wanted nothing more than to bury his past among the quiet rows of grapevines. He told himself that his world was a poisonous flame, that anyone who came too close would be burned to ashes. But then, Clara appeared, a young woman of 27, carrying within her the still bleeding wound of a childhood spent being abandoned again and again. She longed for someone who would stay, while he was a man who always found a way to push others away. This is a story of two broken souls. Will they find the courage to take each other's hand, or will they keep running from their own happiness? Before we step into today's story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support us. We wish you some quiet, heartfelt moments together with this story. Salvatore Moretti spoke those words without daring to look at Clara. They slipped from his lips just as he set down the bottle of wine he had poured from his own vineyard behind the house, beneath the pale yellow porch light of a late autumn evening in the outskirts of Galena. And the moment he realized what he had just said, the hands that had once made men tremble shook faintly, and his heart pounded in a way it had not in 10 long years. Once the most powerful man in Chicago, now all he wanted was to be a quiet vineyard farmer. He had handed everything over to his eldest son, found and bought this small house in a place where no one knew his name, and told himself that the rest of his life should hold nothing more than grapevines, a few beehives, and silence. Because he had buried too many of the people he loved, and he swore to himself that he would never let it happen again. As for Clara, she was only 27. Her father had taught her a bitter lesson from a very young age, that men were promises that turned their backs and walked away, doors that closed, evenings spent by the window waiting for a figure who never came home. And yet the man standing before her now, a man nearly 40 years older, a man the whole world feared, was the first person in her life who was always there whenever she needed him. And now, beneath that porch light, he had just said that he wanted to marry her, only to immediately wish he could swallow back every word he had spoken. What neither of them yet knew was that only a few nights later, in the darkness beyond the edge of the vineyard, a pair of unfamiliar eyes would quietly follow his every step, and the past that Salvatore believed he had buried so deep was about to knock on his door once more. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the faint hum of insects somewhere out among the vines. Then Salvatore straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone flat and careful the way a man's voice does when he is trying to close a door he never meant to open. "Forget I said that," he told her, reaching for the empty crate at his feet as though the work were suddenly the most important thing in the world. It was a foolish thing for an old man to say. Clara did not move. She stood there in the pale light with her arms crossed against the cold, watching him pretend to be busy, and something in her chest ached at how quickly he had folded back into himself. "It didn't sound foolish," she said quietly. Salvatore set the crate down harder than he needed to. "You don't understand, Clara. You look at me, and you see a man who grows grapes and keeps bees and sits on his porch at night, but that is not who I am. That is who I am trying to be. And a man like me has no business putting ideas like that into the head of a woman like you. You have your whole life ahead of you. I should not be standing here talking about marriage." He said the word marriage as though it burned him, and then he looked away toward the dark line of the vineyard, unwilling to meet her eyes. Clara took a step closer, and the old floorboards of the porch creaked beneath her. "And who told you what I need?" she said. Her voice was not angry. It was steadier than that, and somehow that steadiness reached him more than any anger could have. "I never once said I needed a younger man, Salvatore. I never said I needed anything you're pretending you can't give me." He finally turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see the weariness carved into him, the years and the losses sitting heavy behind his eyes. "Don't say that because I fixed your fence and poured you a glass of wine," he said. "I'm not a good man, Clara. I have done things you cannot imagine. People who came close to me have paid for it in ways I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget. So don't look at me like I am something I am not." Clara held his gaze without flinching. "I'm not looking at you because of a fence or a glass of wine," she said, and now something in her own voice trembled, though she refused to let it break. "I'm looking at you because you are the only person I have ever met who is simply here. Do you understand what that means to me? You show up. When the harvest ran late and my hands were bleeding, you were there. When I couldn't sleep and I walked out to the fields at 2 in the morning, your light was on, and you never asked me why. My whole life I have waited by windows for people who promised they would come back and never did. And you, an old man who thinks he is nothing but a shadow, are the first one who never left." Salvatore stood very still. For a man who had spent decades reading the faces of dangerous people, who had built his life on knowing when someone was lying, he found he had no defense against the simple truth in her words, and it frightened him more than any enemy ever had. "This could hurt you," he said at last, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've buried enough people I loved. I don't have it in me to bury another." "Then maybe," Clara said softly, "it's time to stop counting graves and start living." The words landed on him with a weight he had not expected, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Salvatore Moretti did not know what to say. They were standing too close now, close enough that she could see the faint tremor in his hands he was trying so hard to hide, close enough that all it would have taken was one small step from either of them. Neither of them took it. The wind moved through the vines, the porch light flickered once against the dark, and the two of them simply stood there on the edge of something neither was yet brave enough to name, both of them afraid, both of them wanting, and both of them saying nothing at all. The truth was that Clara Bennett had not come to Galena by choice, but by debt. 3 months earlier she had buried her father in a cheap plot outside the city, and 2 weeks after that a man in a gray suit had knocked on the door of her small apartment and set a folder on her kitchen table, and inside that folder was the sum of everything her father had borrowed and never repaid over the long years of his gambling, a number so large it made her stomach drop. The money was owed, the man had explained politely, to certain business interests connected to the Moretti family, and though he never once raised his voice, Clara understood that this was not a debt a person could simply walk away from. So she had done the only thing she could. She had packed what little she owned, closed the door on the bakery job she loved in the city, and driven north until the highways turned to country roads, and she had taken the small rented house at the edge of Salvatore's land and offered to work the harvest to pay down what her father had left behind. She had not expected the old man who owned the vineyard to be anything more than a name on a ledger. She had certainly not expected him to be kind. On the 4th night, when the two of them sat on the porch after the crates had been stacked in the cool of the cellar, Salvatore asked her, in the quiet way he asked everything, what her father had been like. Clara turned the glass slowly in her hands before she answered. "He was a man who was always about to change," she said. "That was the thing about him. He was always about to get the money back, always about to come home early, always about to take me somewhere he had promised. When I was a little girl, he told me once that he would take me to the ocean, that we would leave in the morning and drive until we saw the water, and I packed a bag that night, and I sat by the window with the bag on my lap, and I waited. I waited until the sun came up. He came home 3 days later, and he did not even remember he had promised." Salvatore said nothing, but she felt him listening, and there was something in the weight of his silence that made it easier to keep going. "That was my whole childhood," she said, "sitting by windows, waiting for a man who was always going to come back and never did. I learned to stop unpacking the bag. I learned that when a man tells you he will stay, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is not believe him." She laughed a little then, though there was no joy in it, only the tired honesty of someone who had made peace with an old wound. "So you see," she said, "I am not a woman who is easily charmed by promises. I have heard every promise there is." The old man looked at her for a long moment. "And that is why you fix your own fences," he said quietly, "and why you carry the heavy crates yourself, even when I tell you to leave them." Clara smiled at that, a real smile this time. "Somebody has to," she said. Then she set her glass down and looked out at the dark shapes of the vines, and something crossed her face, something quick and shadowed that Salvatore would only understand much later. "People are always telling me I have my whole life ahead of me," she said, almost to herself, as if that were a comfort, as if the years were a thing anyone could count on. "I stopped believing in the whole life ahead of me a long time ago. I believe in tonight. I believe in whoever is sitting across from me right now. That is all I have ever been able to trust." Salvatore did not know what she meant, not truly, not yet, but the words settled into him and stayed there, and he found himself thinking that this young woman, who had waited her whole life by windows, had learned something that had taken him 65 years and a great deal of grief to understand. That presence was the only promise that ever mattered, and that everything else was just a man in a doorway, halfway gone before he ever arrived. They sat together until the wine was finished and the cold drove them inside, and when Clara walked back across the dark field to her little rented house, she did not look back, because looking back was another thing she had taught herself not to do. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them named, but both came to depend on. Each morning Clara would walk across the field while the dew still clung to the grass, and each morning Salvatore would already be out among the vines, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pair of shears in his weathered hands, and he would nod to her the way one worker nods to another, without ceremony, and they would begin. He never once treated her as though she were fragile, and that, more than anything, was what undid every idea she had carried about the man. When she mishandled a cluster of grapes and crushed it against the basket, he did not sigh or take the work from her hands the way her father would have. He simply showed her again, slower, and let her try until she got it right. "You have good hands," he told her once, watching her tie back a heavy vine. "Steady. Most people rush the harvest and bruise half of what they pick. You don't." Clara had felt her face warm at that, and she had covered it by rolling her eyes. "You say that to all the women who work off their father's debts," she said, and to her surprise the old man laughed, a low, rough sound that seemed to catch even him off guard, as though laughter were a muscle he had not used in a long time and had forgotten still worked. The bees were another matter entirely. Salvatore kept 3 hives at the far edge of the property, and the first time he brought her out to them she stood a careful distance back with her arms wrapped around herself. "They can smell fear," she said suspiciously. "That's dogs," Salvatore said, lifting the lid of the hive with the calm of a man who had faced down things far more dangerous than bees. "This is nothing. Give me your hand." She did not give him her hand. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised, and there was something almost boyish in the challenge of it, and against every instinct she stepped forward and let him guide her fingers near the humming frame, and when nothing stung her and the golden insects simply went about their work, she let out a breath she had not known she was holding and laughed, and Salvatore watched her laugh with an expression she could not quite read. "You see," he said quietly, "not everything that seems dangerous will hurt you." She met his eyes at that, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. In the evenings they cooked together, or rather she cooked and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen making unhelpful observations, and she learned that the man the whole world was said to fear did not know how to boil an egg, that he could dismantle an entire empire but could not tell when the pasta was done, and she teased him without mercy for it, and he took the teasing the way a man takes a gift he did not expect to receive. She had come to Galena believing she would find a monster, a name whispered in that gray office with lowered eyes, a man whose debts a person did not walk away from. Instead, she had found someone who left a lamp burning for her at 2 in the morning, who carried the heaviest crates to her side of the cellar without being asked, who listened when she spoke as though her words were worth the keeping. One evening near the end of the harvest, they sat together on the cellar steps, tired in the good way that honest work makes a person tired, and Clara rested her head against the cool stone wall and closed her eyes, and without thinking, she let her shoulder come to rest against his. Salvatore went very still. For a long moment he did not move at all, as though afraid that any motion might break whatever fragile thing had settled over them, and then, slowly, he let himself stay, let her weight rest against him, let himself feel the simple warmth of another person after 10 years of keeping everyone at the length of an arm. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the light was fading over the vineyard, turning the rose to gold and then to shadow, and inside the cool dark of the cellar, an old man who had promised himself he would never again let anyone close, sat perfectly still so as not to disturb the young woman sleeping against his shoulder, and he understood, with a quiet dread and a quieter joy, that he had already let her closer than was safe. The car that came up the gravel drive 2 days later did not belong to Galena. That much was clear from the moment it appeared at the bend in the road, too new and too polished to belong to any farmer, and Salvatore knew who it was before the door even opened, because only one kind of person drove a car like that, and only one kind of business brought them to his door. The man who stepped out was young, perhaps 35, with dark hair combed neatly back, and the easy confidence of someone who had learned to move through dangerous rooms without ever raising his voice. He wore a suit that fit him well and shoes that had never once seen mud, and he carried a leather case tucked under his arm the way a soldier carries something he has been told to guard. "Dante Rizzo," he said, extending a hand to Clara, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of the engine, and his smile was disarming in a way that seemed practiced but not false. "You must be Miss Bennett." Salvatore came out of the house then, wiping his hands on a cloth, and something in his face shifted when he saw the young man, some old alertness returning to a body that had spent months learning how to rest. "Wow, Dante," he said. His voice was even. "You drove a long way to bring me something I am not going to like." Dante's smile faded into something more careful. "May I sit?" he asked, and Salvatore gestured to the chairs on the porch, and the three of them settled around the small wooden table while the afternoon light stretched long across the vines. "It's the Castellanos," Dante said without further ceremony, and Clara watched the old man's jaw tighten at the name. "They're moving again, quietly, for now, but moving. And they've been buying up old paper, Salvatore, old debts, anything that touches the family." He set the leather case on the table and opened it, and drew out a folder that Clara recognized at once, the same gray folder that had been placed on her kitchen table 3 months before, and her stomach turned. "This," Dante said, sliding it toward her, "is your father's debt, and someone has been very interested in it lately." Clara stared at the folder as though it were something alive. "What does my father's debt have to do with the Castellanos?" she asked. Dante's expression was gentle, but his words were not. "Because a debt is leverage," he said. "As long as that money is owed to the Moretti family, and as long as you are the one who owes it, you are a thread that connects you to Salvatore, and you to him, and them to both of you, and the Castellanos have never in their lives passed up a thread they could pull." He turned the pages slowly, pointing out clauses in the dense legal language, showing where the debt had been recorded, and transferred, and recorded again, and as he spoke, Clara found herself leaning closer, following the thread of his reasoning, and she had to admit that despite everything the man was clever, careful, that he saw things in the paperwork that she never would have seen. "Here," Dante said, tapping a line. "This is where it gets interesting. The way this was filed, there may be a way to challenge it, to break the connection entirely. It would take time, but time is what we need." And through all of it, Salvatore said very little. He sat back in his chair just outside the circle of afternoon light, his arms crossed, and he watched. He watched the way the young man leaned over the folder beside Clara, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He watched how the two of them spoke the same quick language, how they were nearly of an age, how Dante talked of years and delays and futures, with the easy certainty of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Salvatore felt something tighten in his chest that had no name he wished to give it, though it had an age, and the age was his own. He said nothing. Men like Salvatore did not say such things. He only noted, in some quiet and unwelcome corner of his mind, that Dante Rizzo was exactly the kind of man the whole world would say belonged beside a woman like Clara, and he turned his eyes back to the vineyard so that neither of them would see what had crossed his face. It was well past midnight when Clara finally set down the last of the folders, her eyes burning from hours spent poring over the columns of her father's debt by lamplight, and she stepped out onto the porch to clear her head before the long walk back across the field to her own house. The night was cold and clear, the sky thick with stars the way it never was in the city, and for a moment she simply stood there breathing in the sharp autumn air, listening to the quiet. Then she saw it. At the far edge of the vineyard, where the rows of vines gave way to the dark line of trees along the property fence, something moved. It was not the wind, and it was not an animal. It was the shape of a man, still and deliberate, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, and even in the darkness she could tell that he was watching the house, that he had been watching it for some time. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not scream, and she did not run, because some instinct older than fear told her that sudden movement would only tell the watcher he had been seen. Instead, she stepped slowly back through the door, her heart hammering, and she found Salvatore in the study where he sat with a single lamp and a glass of wine he had not touched. "Salvatore," she said, and something in her voice made him look up at once. "There's a man, at the edge of the vineyard, by the trees. He's watching the house." The change that came over the old man was immediate and complete, and it frightened her more than the figure outside had, because in an instant the tired vineyard farmer was gone, and in his place sat the man the world had once feared, his face gone hard and unreadable, his eyes suddenly very awake. He rose without a word and crossed to the window, moving to the side of it rather than standing before it, and he looked out into the dark for a long moment. When he turned back to his expression had smoothed into something calm and reassuring, but Clara had spent enough of her life reading the faces of men who were about to disappoint her to know when someone was hiding something. "It's nothing," he said. "Probably a hunter who wandered off the road, or a boy from the town daring his friends. This is the country, Clara. People walk where they please." But even as he said it, he was drawing the curtain closed, and he did not sit back down. "I know what I saw," Clara said quietly. "That was not a lost hunter. He stood watching this house like he was memorizing it." Salvatore looked at her, and for a moment something passed behind his eyes, something she could not name, and then he crossed to her and put a hand on her shoulder, and his touch was gentle, even as his voice remained firm. "You are tired," he said. "You have been staring at that debt half the nig hat, and your mind is turning shadows into men. Let me walk you home, and lock your doors, and in the morning this will all seem smaller." She wanted to argue, but the hour was late, and the cold had settled into her bones, and so she let him walk her across the field, and she noticed that he kept himself between her and the dark line of the trees the entire way, and that his eyes never stopped moving. At her door he waited until she had turned the lock, and only then did he walk back, and Clara watched him go from her window, an old man crossing a field of stars, and she saw him stop once at the edge of his own porch and stand for a long time looking out toward the trees. What Clara could not know was that Salvatore had recognized the shape of that stillness, that particular patient way of watching that belonged only to men who had been sent, and that back inside his darkened study he stood for the rest of that night without sleeping, one hand resting on the drawer of his desk, and that for the first time since he had come to Galena to grow old in peace, he understood that the peace had been a borrowed thing all along, and that the past he had buried so carefully had finally found the road to his door. Dante had told them that if there was any hope of breaking the debt cleanly, they would need the original paperwork, the first records of what had truly been borrowed and what had truly been repaid, and Salvatore had gone quiet at that, because he knew where such records were kept, and it was the one room in the house he had not entered in 10 years. The next morning he led Clara down a hallway she had never walked before, to a door at the far end that he had always kept closed, and he stood before it with his hand on the knob for a long time without turning it. "This was Isabella's room," he said at last, and his voice was not the voice of a mafia boss or a vineyard farmer, but simply that of a man standing at the edge of his own grief. "My wife. She kept the accounts, all of them, the family's and later our own. If there is a record of what your father truly owed, it will be in here." Clara said nothing. She understood that whatever this cost him was not hers to hurry. When he finally opened the door, the air inside was still and close, the air of a room that had been sealed against time, and Clara saw at once that nothing in it had been moved, that a pair of reading glasses still lay folded on the desk where their owner had left them, that a shawl still hung over the back of the chair as though its wearer had only stepped out for a moment and would return. Salvatore stood in the doorway and did not go in. His hand gripped the frame of the door, and Clara watched the man who feared nothing struggle simply to cross a threshold. "Do you want to stop?" she asked gently. "No," he said, though he did not move. "I have kept this door closed for 10 years because I told myself that as long as I did not open it, nothing had truly changed, that she was only in the next room. Foolish, for a man my age." He drew a breath and stepped inside, and it seemed to cost him something to do it, and Clara followed quietly behind. They worked in silence for a while, and Clara was careful, treating each object she touched as though it were something sacred, because to Salvatore it was. She found ledgers stacked in neat columns, their pages filled with a small, precise hand, and she understood without being told that this handwriting had belonged to a woman who had loved order the way some people love music. Salvatore moved slowly through the room, and now and then he would pause over some small thing, a pen, a photograph turned face down, and his face would go somewhere far away, and Clara let him go there without a word. She was the one who found the box. It was pushed to the back of a low shelf beneath the window, a plain wooden box with a lid that had warped slightly with age, and when Clara lifted it down and set it on the desk, Salvatore went very still. Inside, on top of a bundle of old account books tied with string, lay a stack of letters and a single leather notebook, worn soft at the corners, its cover marked with nothing but a date. Salvatore reached out and touched it, and then drew his hand back as though it had burned him. "That is her diary," he said quietly. "I did not know she kept it here." Clara looked at him. "We don't have to open it," she said. "We're looking for the accounts. The letters and the diary have nothing to do with your father's debt." But Salvatore was staring at the small worn notebook as though it had spoken his name, and something in his face had begun to break open, some grief he had spent a decade holding at arm's length, now standing directly before him on the desk, and Clara understood that whatever they had come into this room to find, they had found something else instead, something that had been waiting 10 years in a sealed room for the man who was finally brave enough to open the door. For a long moment, Salvatore only looked at the diary, and then, with the slow care of a man handling something that might shatter, he picked it up and opened it, and Clara saw his eyes move across the small, precise hand of a woman 10 years gone. He turned the pages slowly, and his face grew tighter with each one, and Clara stepped back to give him the privacy of it, until he stopped on one of the final pages and went completely still, and something in the stillness told her that whatever he was reading now was not an account of days, but something meant for him. "Salvatore," she said softly, but he did not answer. He read, and read again, his free hand gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles whitened, and when at last he spoke, his voice was thick and broken in a way she had never heard from him. "She knew," he said. "She wrote this near the end, when the doctors had already told us how little time there was. She knew what I would do after she was gone." Clara came quietly to his side, and though she did not ask, he began to read the words aloud, haltingly, as though each one required something of him. His wife had written to him across the distance of 10 years, and she had written that she did not blame him for the life they had lived, that she had known who he was when she chose him and had never once regretted it. She had written that what had taken her was not his doing, that the men who had informed on the family and set in motion the terrible night that ended her life had made their own choices, and that he was not to carry the weight of it, not to spend the years he had left believing that loving her had killed her. And then, near the end, she had written the words that undid him. "Do not seal yourself away," she had written. "Do not make my death into a wall you hide behind for the rest of your days. You were not made to be alone, Salvatore, whatever you tell yourself now. When you are ready, and I pray that you will let yourself be ready, Let the sorrow go a little at a time. Laugh again without asking my permission. Love again without calling it a betrayal. I did not marry a man so that he could bury himself beside me. I married him so that he could live, and I want him to live, even the part of his life that comes after me." Salvatore's breath caught, and he lowered the diary. And Clara watched the man the whole world had feared, the man who had commanded rooms with a single look, come apart in the quiet of a sealed room. A single tear traced its way down the deep lines of his face, and then another, and he did not wipe them away, did not try to hide them. And Clara understood that these were tears 10 years in the holding, tears he had refused to shed at the funeral and every day since. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have made the moment smaller than it was. She simply stepped close and put her arms around him, holding him the way one holds someone who is finally allowing themselves to fall, and after a moment she felt him lean into it, this proud and guarded old man, felt the weight of his grief settle against her shoulder. "She knew," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. "All these years I told myself that letting anyone close would be spitting on her memory, that I had no right, and she saw it coming. She left me these words so that I would find them one day and I would not have that excuse." Clara held him and said nothing, and let him weep in the room he had kept closed for a decade, and outside the window the vineyard stretched golden in the late morning light, indifferent and beautiful, and inside a man who had believed his heart had died with his wife, discovered that it had only been waiting, all this time, for permission to beat again. It was Clara who returned to the box a while later, once Salvatore had gone to wash his face and gather himself, because the accounts were still the reason they had come, and she untied the string around the old ledgers and began to search for any record of her father's name. She found it near the bottom of the stack, in a separate folder of its own, and at first she thought there had been a mistake, because the number written beside her father's name was not the number the man in the gray suit had shown her 3 months before. It was far larger. She read it twice, then a third time, certain her tired eyes had misplaced a figure, but the number did not change, and beneath it was a clause written in the same careful hand, and as she read that clause, the floor seemed to shift beneath her. "Salvatore," she said when he came back into the room, and something in her voice made him stop in the doorway. "What is this?" He crossed to her and took the folder, and she watched his face as he read, watched the softness that Isabella's letter had left in him harden slowly into something grim. The debt her father had left was not merely money owed to some vague business interest, as she had been told. It was bound directly to the Moretti family, secured under the old codes by which such families had always done business, and the clause beneath it stated plainly that until the sum was repaid in full, the debtor and everything tied to the debtor's name belonged, in the eyes of that old and merciless law, to the family that held the paper. Clara looked up at him, and her voice when it came was very quiet. "It says I belong to you," she said, "until it's paid. It says I am something you own." Salvatore set the folder down. "Clara, it is not like that. It is written right here," she said, and now her hands had begun to tremble, not with fear, but with something worse. "Every day I have worked in your vineyard. Every meal we cooked, every night you left the lamp burning for me, and this whole time there was a paper that said I was yours before I ever chose to be. Do you understand what that does to me? I have spent my whole life belonging to no one, waiting for people who never came, and I told myself that at least what I had was mine, at least when I gave something it was because I wanted to. And now you tell me it was written down before I even arrived." He took a step toward her. "I will never use this," he said, and his voice was low and urgent. "I did not know it existed. I would burn it this moment if you asked me to. You do not have to fear a single word of it." But Clara had already stepped back from the desk, and there was a weariness in her eyes that no reassurance could reach. "The problem is not that you would use it, Salvatore," she said. "The problem is that it exists at all. When you looked at me on that porch and said you would marry me if you were a different man, I let myself believe it was real. And now I will never know if what grew between us was something we chose or something a piece of paper decided for us years ago." She picked up her coat from the chair. "I need to go. "Clara," he said, but she was already at the door. "Please," he said again, and it was the closest to pleading she had ever heard from him. "Do not walk out of this room believing that what I feel for you came from a ledger." She stopped in the doorway, and for a moment he thought she might turn back, but she did not. "It doesn't matter what you believe," she said softly, without looking at him. "It matters what I can trust. And right now I can't trust any of it." Then she was gone down the long hallway, and he heard the front door open and close, and Salvatore Moretti was left standing alone in his dead wife's room, holding in one hand the letter that had permitted him to love again, and in the other the paper that had just taken it away. 2 days later, Salvatore drove into the city, because the paper on his desk and the shape in the trees had told him the same thing, that the quiet years were over, and there were men he needed to see before the Castellanos moved again. The family gathered that evening in the private back room of the old restaurant that had served as neutral ground for 3 generations, and though Salvatore had handed the reins to his son, his presence at the long table still turned every head, still lowered every voice, because a man does not stop being feared simply because he has chosen to grow grapes. Among them sat his brother Vincent, younger than Salvatore by a decade, a man who had spent his whole life a single seat to the left of power and had never stopped resenting the distance. Vincent had a smile that never reached his eyes, and a gift for saying cruel things gently, and it was he who steered the talk, once the business of the Castellanos had been laid out, toward the vineyard and toward the woman who worked it. "I hear you have company these days," Vincent said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Out there among your grapes. A young one, they tell me. Very young." He let the words settle, and around the table a few eyes lifted. "The daughter of a gambler who died owing us a fortune," Vincent went on, his tone light as a blade drawn slowly. "And now she lives at the edge of your land and cooks your meals and, what? Works off her dead father's debt with her charm. Salvatore, I only worry for you. A man who has lost as much as you have, alone all these years, and suddenly a girl 40 years younger appears with nothing but a debt to her name and a great deal of interest in the man who holds it." He spread his hands as though the conclusion were too obvious to speak. "People are talking, is all. They wonder what a woman like that wants from a man like you, and they answer their own question." Salvatore had not touched his own glass since he sat down, and he did not touch it now. He let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable, until even Vincent's practiced smile began to falter, and then he spoke, and though his voice was quiet, it carried to every corner of the room the way only a truly dangerous man's quiet voice can. "You will say her name," he said, "or you will not speak of her at all." Vincent's smile thinned. "I meant no. You meant everything," Salvatore said. "I have known you your whole life, Vincent. You have never in that time said a soft thing without a knife folded inside it. So let me be plain, so there is no confusion at this table. That woman has more honor in the dirt under her fingernails than most of the men in this room have in their whole bodies. She came to pay a debt she did not make. She has asked me for nothing. And the first man who repeats this poison about her, in this city, in my hearing or out of it, will answer to me. And I am not so old and so gentle among my grapevines that any of you should like to test what that means." The table had gone very still. His son watched him from the head of it with an unreadable expression. Vincent inclined his head, all deference now, all apology, but Salvatore had spent a lifetime reading faces, and he saw the thing that flickered behind his brother's eyes before it was hidden, and it was not shame, it was calculation. As the gathering broke and the men filed out into the night, Salvatore stood alone by the window for a moment, and he thought about the shape in the trees, and the debt that had grown so much larger than it should have been, and his brother's careful poisonous concern, and he began to understand that the threads were not scattered at all, that someone had gathered them into a single hand, and that whoever held them had chosen Clara as the place to pull. The talk that Vincent had planted in the city did not stay in the city, because such things never do, and by the end of the week it had traveled north to Galena and settled in the low murmurs of the men who came to help with the last of the pressing, and Clara felt it the moment she walked into the barn where the family and the hired hands had gathered, felt the way the conversation dropped, and the eyes slid toward her and away. She had spent 3 days keeping to her own house, wrestling with the paper that said she was owned, but she had not come this far in her life by hiding from a room that had decided something about her, and so she walked to the center of it with her chin up and set down the basket she was carrying. "Good afternoon," she said brightly to the room at large. "I can see you've all been busy. Please, don't stop the whispering on my account. I'd hate to interrupt such important work." A few of the men had the grace to look at their boots. One did not, an older cousin of Vincent's, and he muttered something to the man beside him about gamblers' daughters and old men's fortunes, just loud enough to be meant for her. Clara turned to him with a smile so pleasant it could have curdled milk. "Oh, you should say it to my face," she said. "It's a marvelous plan you've all worked out for me. I buried my father, packed everything I owned, drove 3 hours north, and now I spend my days with my arms in grape pulp up to the elbow, and my nights reading legal documents by a lamp. Truly, the cunning of it. If I wanted to seduce a rich man for his money, I promise you I'd have chosen a cleaner line of work than this." The younger of the hired men choked back a laugh, and the cousin's face went red, and Clara picked her basket back up as though nothing had happened. "In a room this small," she said, "you either learn to laugh or you lose your mind. I've chosen to laugh." It was into this that Salvatore arrived, and he had heard enough from the doorway to understand what was happening, and he did not raise his voice, but he crossed the barn with the paper already in his hand, the folder from Isabella's room, the debt that bound her, and he stopped in the center of the floor where everyone could see. "This town," he said, "and the family, and every mouth that has been busy this week, will find something else to talk about, because there is nothing here." He held the folder up between them all, in plain view, and then he tore it, once and then again, and let the pieces fall to the floor of the barn. "She owes this family nothing," he said. "Let that be the end of it." The room was silent. Clara stared at the torn paper on the ground, and then at him, her throat tight. "You just tore up a fortune," she said quietly. "I tore up a lie," he answered. But Dante, who had come north with the family and had been standing quietly at the edge of the barn through all of it, was not looking at either of them. He had crouched down where the pieces had fallen, and he was fitting 2 of them together between his fingers, turning them toward the light from the open barn door, and something in his posture had changed, the easy lawyer's calm gone entirely still. "Salvatore," he said, and his voice had lost all its polish. "Who signed this document?" "My father," Salvatore said, "and after him, the family's accountant." "Why?" Dante rose slowly, holding one of the fragments up to the light, and when he spoke, there was an edge of disbelief in his voice. "Because the signature underneath has been scraped away," he said, "and another written over it." He turned the paper so they could see. "This number, this clause, the part that says she belongs to the family until it's paid. It wasn't here originally. Someone altered this. This debt has been forged." They gathered the torn pieces from the barn floor and carried them back to the house, and Dante spread them across the kitchen table and worked over them for the better part of 2 hours, laying the fragments beside the original ledgers from Isabella's room, comparing the careful hand of the dead woman's records against the altered folder, and Clara and Salvatore sat across from him and waited while the afternoon light moved across the floor. At last, Dante sat back, rubbed his eyes, and told them what he had found. "The debt is real," he said. "That much is true. Your father did borrow from the family, Clara, years ago, and he did gamble it away. But the number he owed was a fraction of what that folder claims. And more than that, he made payments. Small ones, over years, right up until the end. By the time he died, the real debt was almost gone. There was perhaps 1/10 of it left, a sum you could have cleared in a season of honest work." Clara stared at him. Then the number the man in the gray suit showed me. "Inflated," Dante said, "multiplied many times over. And the clause that bound you to the family, the one that said you belonged to them until it was paid, that was never in the original at all. Someone took a nearly settled debt and rebuilt it into a chain." He tapped the altered signature, "and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. This is not the work of a clerk making an honest mistake. This was made to look real, made to hold up if no one ever thought to question it, because who would? A frightened young woman with no family and no money does not hire lawyers to examine the fine print of what she is told she owes. She simply pays, or she runs, or she does what she is told. Salvatore's face had gone very hard. Then this was never about the money, he said. No, Dante said. It was about her, and through her, about you. Someone wanted a thread that tied Clara to this family so tightly that she could be used, moved, threatened, and every time they pulled it, it would pull on you as well. He looked at Salvatore. Whoever built this wanted a way to reach you, and they chose the one person you would not be able to walk away from. Clara felt cold all through, because she understood now that she had been chosen, that her grief and her debt and her long, lonely drive north had all been arranged by a hand she had never seen. Who, she said, who does something like this? Dante hesitated, and then he drew out one of the newer records, the ones tracing where the debt had been bought and transferred in recent months, and he laid his finger on a name near the bottom, a company that led to another company that led, at last, to a single door. This paper was purchased by a broker, he said, and that broker has done business, quietly, with the Castellanos, and whoever arranged it inside this family, whoever had the access to reach into the old records and alter a document sealed years ago, was someone close, someone trusted, someone who could walk into a room full of the family's secrets and not be questioned. Salvatore was very quiet, and Clara watched a name form behind his eyes that he did not yet say aloud. And then, as though the memory had been waiting for this exact moment, she thought of the shape in the trees, the patient watching figure at the edge of the vineyard, the stillness Salvatore had recognized and pretended not to. That man, she said slowly, the one I saw watching the house, he wasn't a hunter, he was theirs. Salvatore rose from the table and crossed to the darkened window, and he looked out at the vineyard where the light was failing, and this time he did not tell her she was imagining shadows. They have been watching for weeks, he said quietly, and now they will know that we have found the forgery, that the chain is broken, that their thread has been cut. He turned back to them and his face was grave, which means they will not wait much longer. They will stop watching, and they will act. In the days that followed, Dante did not return to the city. He told them it was so he could keep working the legal angle, so he could be near if the Castellanos moved, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth, and Clara understood as much when he began to arrive at her little house each morning with a reason that grew thinner by the day. One morning it was a form that only she could sign, another it was a question he could have asked over the telephone, and on the third morning he came with no reason at all, only a handful of wildflowers he had picked from the roadside, still damp with dew. "These are for you," he said, holding them out with a smile that was, she had to admit, difficult to dislike. "I saw them on the drive and thought of you." Clara took them because it would have been unkind not to, and she set them in a jar of water on the windowsill, and she let him stay and talk, because he was clever and quick, and he made her laugh in a way that cost her nothing, and there was a part of her, the tired and lonely part that had waited by so many windows, that was not immune to a young man who kept showing up. They sat on her small porch, and he told her stories of the city, and she teased him about his spotless shoes, and for an hour the paper and the watchers and the whole dark weight of it lifted a little. What Clara did not see, because it was hidden behind the rows of the vineyard, was that Salvatore had come to the bend in the road that morning and had seen the flowers pass from Dante's hand to hers, had seen her laugh, had seen the two of them sitting together in the easy way of people who belong to the same season of life. He did not come down. He turned back to his own house, and he did not visit her that day, nor the next, nor the day after that. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself that this was the very thing Isabella's letter had asked of him in reverse, that if he truly wished the girl well, he would step back and let a younger man, an honest man, a man without a lifetime of blood behind him, be the one to stay. He told himself all of this, and he believed almost none of it, and each evening he sat alone on his porch, with a glass of wine he did not drink, and watched the light in her window across the field. Clara noticed his absence at once. The first day she told herself he was busy. The second day she found herself glancing toward the property line every little while, waiting for the familiar shape of him among the vines. By the third day she had stopped pretending, and she stood at her window in the evening looking out at his darkened porch and felt the old and hateful ache of it, the ache of waiting for someone to appear who did not. And she was furious to find that at 27 she had walked all the way across the country and into the arms of the same feeling she had carried since she was a child. She could have crossed the field and knocked on his door. She thought about it a dozen times, but something held her there, some tangle of pride and fear and the memory of every time she had gone chasing after a man who had already decided to be gone, and so she stayed, and she waited, and she hated herself a little for waiting. That night, standing at the window, a wave of dizziness came over her so suddenly that she had to put a hand against the frame, and her stomach turned, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. She pressed her fingers to her lips and breathed until it passed. It was nothing, she told herself, only the strain of these long, strange weeks, the poor sleep, the meals she kept forgetting to eat. She had never been one to fuss over her own body. She let the feeling go the way she let most things go, and she went to bed, and she did not think of it again. Every autumn the family held a charity gala in the grand old hall on the edge of the city, a night of chandeliers and long tables and quiet money, the one occasion on which the world that Salvatore had spent his life in put on its finest face and pretended, for a few hours, to be something gentler than it was. He had not meant to attend, but his son had asked him to come, and Dante had insisted that Clara be invited as well, and so it was that on a cold night in late autumn Clara walked into that hall in a deep blue gown borrowed from a seamstress in town, her hair swept up for the first time since she had come north, and the room, for just a moment, went quiet. The very people who had spent weeks whispering about the gambler's daughter now found they had nothing to say, and Clara moved through their stares with her chin lifted, because she had learned long ago that the only way to walk through a room that has judged you is to walk as though you have already won. Dante found her almost at once. He looked well in his dark suit, and his smile when he saw her was unguarded in a way it had not been before. "May I have this dance?" he asked, and because the music had begun, and because it would have made a scene to refuse, she placed her hand in his. He danced the way men of the city learn to dance, lightly and with confidence, and he made her laugh twice before the first song had ended, and near the edge of the floor, leaning against a marble column with a glass in his hand that he had not once lifted to his lips, Salvatore watched them. He watched the way the young man's hand rested at her waist, the way she smiled up at him, the way they moved together as though the years had made them for the same world, and something in the old man's chest closed quietly like a door. When the music slowed, Dante drew her a little closer, and his voice when he spoke was low and serious. "I have been telling myself for weeks that I was staying for the case," he said, "but I think you have known for longer than I have that it was never only that. Clara, I am not a man who says these things lightly. I am falling in love with you, and I would like, if you would let me, to be the one who is there." Clara's breath caught, and she did not know what to say, because the words were kind, and they were honest, and they were everything a sensible woman ought to want, and across the hall, past the turning couples, she saw Salvatore set down his untouched glass. He had not heard the words, but he had seen enough. The closeness, the seriousness in the young man's face, the way Clara had gone still in his arms, and Salvatore understood it the way he understood everything, quickly and without mercy to himself. This was the choice being made in front of him, and he told himself it was the right one. A man like Dante could give her a life in the light. A man like Salvatore could only give her his enemies, his ghosts, and eventually, he was certain, her own name carved into stone beside Isabella's. His world was a comet. He had known it from the first. And so, believing that the kindest thing he could do was to remove himself from her path entirely, he turned to leave. It was as he moved toward the doors that he felt it, a prickle at the back of his neck that a lifetime in his profession had taught him never to ignore, and he glanced across the crowded hall and saw, near the service entrance, a face that did not belong, a man in a plain dark coat who was not drinking and not talking and not dancing, a man who was watching the room the way the shape in the trees had watched the house. For an instant their eyes met, and then the man was gone, slipping back through the doors into the dark. Salvatore stood very still amid the music and the light, and the old cold certainty settled over him that the piece was over, that they were no longer content to watch, and that they had chosen this night, of all nights, to come close. Salvatore did not raise the alarm inside the hall, because a room full of frightened people is a room that cannot be controlled, and because some part of him had understood, from the moment he saw that watching face, that whatever was coming was meant for him alone, and that the surest way to keep everyone else safe was to walk out to meet it. He caught his son's eye across the crowded floor and gave him a single small nod, the old signal between them that meant stay, keep the family close, ask no questions yet, and then he slipped out through the side doors into the cold and the dark of the parking area beyond, where the noise of the gala faded to a murmur behind him, and the only light came from a few lamps scattered among the parked cars. They were waiting for him. He had known they would be. 3 of them stepped out from between the vehicles, unhurried, the way men move when they believe they have already won, and the one in the plain dark coat, the watcher from inside, walked at their center. "Mr. Moretti," the man said, with a politeness that was worse than any threat, "it has been a long time since anyone had the pleasure. Some people would very much like to speak with you." Salvatore stood very still, and he did not run, because a man of 65 does not outrun 3 men half his age, and because running would only send them back through those doors after everyone he loved. He thought, in that strange, slowed moment, not of himself but of his son at the head of the family, and of the trap this truly was, that they had not come to harm him at all, but to hold him, to use him, to press him like a blade against Marco's throat, until the boy gave them everything the family had spent 3 generations protecting. "So that is the game," Salvatore said quietly. "You take the father to bend the son." The man in the coat only smiled. Inside the hall, Clara had lost sight of him. One moment Salvatore had been at the edge of the floor, and the next, the marble column stood empty, and a cold prickle of dread ran through her that she could not explain. She began to move through the crowd toward the side doors, her borrowed gown catching against the press of bodies, and it was then that the lights of the great chandeliers overhead flickered once, twice, and went out, plunging the entire hall into darkness. The music died with a discordant scrape. There were screams, the nervous kind that turn quickly to panic, the sound of chairs overturning and glasses shattering, and in the sudden blind dark the whole room surged in every direction at once. Clara was carried backward by the crush of it, her heart hammering, calling his name into a darkness that swallowed the sound. "Salvatore," she cried. Then a hand closed around hers, firm and certain, and pulled her sideways out of the current of bodies, and for one wild instant her heart leapt, because she was sure it was him, sure he had come back through the dark to find her the way he always found her. The emergency lights snapped on a moment later, casting the hall in a dim red glow, and Clara turned to the man who held her hand. It was not Salvatore, it was Dante, his face tight with fear, his grip on her hand refusing to let go. "I have you," he said breathlessly. "Stay with me. It's not safe. We have to get you out." Clara pulled against him, twisting to look back toward the side doors, and through the panicked crowd and the red half-light, she saw them swinging shut, saw the cold dark of the parking lot beyond, and she understood all at once, with a horror that stopped her breath, that in the moment the lights had failed, Salvatore had already been gone. She tore her hand from Dante's and forced her way toward the doors, shoving through the frightened crowd, and burst out into the night, but the parking lot was empty. There was only the cold and the scattered lamps, and a single overturned glass on the ground catching the light, and far off, at the mouth of the road, the red glow of taillights already vanishing into the dark. Clara stood alone in the emptiness where he had been, and screamed his name, and no one answered. In the chaos that followed, the family closed ranks the way it always had, and the word that spread among them in the hours after the gala was that the old man had simply left, had grown tired of the noise and the crowd, and slipped away home as he often did, and there were even those who muttered that perhaps he had run from something, from the Castellanos, from his own fears, from the girl. Clara alone knew better, because Clara alone had seen the taillights vanishing down the road, and Clara alone remembered the shape in the trees at the edge of the vineyard, the patient watching figure that Salvatore had recognized and pretended not to. She sat through that endless night piecing it together, the watcher at the property line, the second watcher at the gala, the forged debt built to make her a thread, and she understood with a terrible clarity that all of it had been leading to this single night, that they had never wanted her at all, that she had only ever been the way in, and that the man who had left a lamp burning for her at 2 a.m. had walked out into the dark to keep it from touching anyone else. She went to Marco at dawn. Salvatore's eldest son had never hidden his feelings about her, and he did not hide them now, meeting her at the door of the family house with a face like a closed fist. "You," he said, "you have some nerve coming here. My father vanishes in the middle of the worst night this family has had in years, and the woman at the center of it walks up to my door." Clara did not flinch. "Your father did not vanish," she said. "He was taken." Marco's jaw tightened. "My father is not a man who is taken. He is the man who does the taking, or he was, before he chose grapes over his own blood. He is embarrassed, or he is hiding, and either way it is not your concern." He moved to close the door, and Clara put her hand against it. "Listen to me," she said, and something in her voice made him stop. "Weeks ago, I saw a man watching the house from the tree line. Your father recognized the way he stood. He told me it was a hunter, but he sat awake all night with his hand on his desk drawer. At the gala, there was another man, by the service doors, watching the room the same way, and your father saw him, and the moment he did, he left through the side doors alone. And then the lights failed, and when they came back he was gone, and I saw the tail lights on the road." She drew a breath. An embarrassed man does not signal his son to keep the family close and then walk out to meet 3 men in the dark. He does that when he is protecting you, when he knows they came for him so they could reach you. Marco stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the certainty in his face war with something else. The memory perhaps of that single small nod his father had given him across the floor, the signal he had told himself meant nothing. "Why would they take him and not simply act?" he said slowly, though the anger had begun to drain from his voice. "Because he is worth more to them alive," Clara said. "He is the blade they hold against you. As long as they have him, they have you." And she reached into her coat and drew out the folder, the forged debt, the altered signatures Dante had uncovered, and she laid it in his hands. "This is how they built the door," she said. "Someone inside this family helped them, someone with access to reach into records sealed years ago. Your father knew it too. He was beginning to understand it the night they took him." Marco looked down at the papers, and then back at her, and the closed fist of his face had not opened. Not entirely, but the door was no longer shutting. "I do not trust you," he said flatly. "Good," Clara answered. "You would be a fool to. But right now I am the only person in this whole family who believes your father is still worth looking for. So you can trust me later. For now, help me find him." It was Dante who found the thread that led them, working through the night over the broker's records with Clara at his shoulder, and Marco pacing behind them, tracing the forged debt back through the chain of companies until one of them resolved into a name, a property, an old shipping warehouse near the water on the edge of the city that the family had once used and long abandoned, a place that appeared on no current record but one, a lease quietly renewed some months before by a company whose signature Dante had seen already that week, scraped and rewritten on a folder in a barn. He turned the page toward Marco without a word, and Marco looked at the signature, and his face went pale and then very hard, because he knew that hand. "It's my uncle," Marco said quietly. "It's Vincent, the one man who could walk into our sealed records and never be questioned." the one man who has spent his whole life a seat away from my father's chair. They went at once, and the drive to the water was long and silent, and Clara sat in the back with her heart in her throat and thought of nothing but the old man who had walked into the dark so that it would not touch her. The warehouse sat black and hulking against the night sky, and Marco brought his people quietly, and what happened at its doors Clara only half understood. The low, urgent movements of men in the dark, the sudden collapse of a plan that had counted on no one ever finding this place, the confusion of the Castellano men caught between an enemy they thought they had outmaneuvered and the terrible cold fury of a son who had come for his father. She was told to stay back, to wait in the car where it was safe, and she did not. While the others moved on the main doors, she slipped along the side of the building through the dark, because she could not sit still while somewhere inside those walls Salvatore was being held, and she found a smaller door left unguarded in the chaos, and she went through it into the black interior alone. Inside it was vast and dark and cold, stacked with the shadows of forgotten crates, and Clara moved through it with her hands out before her and her heart pounding, following the faint sound of voices, crossing the darkness the way she had once crossed a rain-soaked field in her mind 100 times, toward the one person who had never left her waiting. She found him in a small side room, a single bare bulb burning above him, and standing over him was Vincent, and the sight of the old man there, weary and bruised at the cheek but unbowed, his eyes lifting to meet hers across the room, nearly stopped her heart. Vincent turned at the sound of her, and his careful smile was gone now, replaced by something uglier and more frightened, the face of a man whose long, patient plan had come apart in a single night. "You," he said. "Of course it is you, the thread that would not stay where I put it." And in that moment, as Vincent's attention swung toward her, Salvatore moved, and the room erupted into the sounds Clara would never afterward be able to describe. And then the main doors gave way at the far end of the warehouse, and Marco's voice was ringing through the dark, and it was over almost as quickly as it began, Vincent seized and the last of it collapsing around him. Clara crossed the room without seeing any of it, saw only Salvatore, and she went to her knees beside him and took his face in her hands. "You came," he said, and his voice was hoarse and disbelieving. "Across all of that, you came." "Of course I came," she said, and she was crying now, and laughing through it. "I told you, if you ever ran again, I would cross anything to reach you. Did you think the dark would stop me?" Salvatore looked at her in the harsh light of that bare bulb. This woman who had pieced together what an entire family had missed, who had walked into the blackness alone to find him. And for the first time in his long and guarded life, the old certainty that his world could only bring death to the ones he loved cracked straight down the middle. Because here she was, alive, holding his face in her hands, having walked through the very worst of that world to reach him, and having come out the other side still whole, still his, still refusing to leave. Marco would not let them return to the vineyard that night, not until his people had made certain that the last of the Castellano threat was truly cut and the roads were clear, and so he sent them to one of the family's quiet houses at the edge of the countryside, a small, safe place that no record connected to anyone. And there Salvatore and Clara found themselves alone for the first time since the gala, in a plain kitchen with a single working stove and a pantry that had clearly not been stocked with guests in mind. Clara opened the cupboards one after another and surveyed the contents with the grim honesty of a woman taking inventory of a disaster. "1 tin of beans," she announced, "half a box of pasta, an onion that has seen better years, and something in a jar that I refuse to be held responsible for identifying." Salvatore, who was sitting at the small table pressing a cloth to the bruise on his cheek, peered over at the jar. "Olives," he said. "Are you certain?" Clara asked. "They were olives once," he said. He watched her light the stove and set a pot on it, and when she began combining the sad ingredients with the confidence of someone who had decided that hesitation was the enemy, he could not keep the doubt from his face. "You are putting the beans in with the pasta," he said. "I am improvising," she said. "My grandmother could make a feast out of nothing. Did you inherit this gift?" he asked. Clara considered the pot. "We will find out in 20 minutes," she said. They found out. Salvatore lifted the first forkful to his mouth with the wary courage of a man who had faced down armed enemies, chewed slowly, and set the fork down. "Well," he said. "It's hot," Clara offered. "That is a point in its favor," he agreed. "Tell the truth," she said. "You have eaten in the finest rooms in the country." He tasted it again, as though hoping the second attempt might contradict the first. "It has character," he said at last, and Clara burst out laughing, and after a moment the old man laughed too, a real laugh, the kind that seemed to loosen something in his chest, and they ate the terrible meal together by the light of the single lamp, because it was warm and because it was theirs. It was while they ate that Clara's phone lit with a message, and she read it and went quiet, and then she turned the screen so he could see. It was from Dante. "I heard he is safe," the message read. "I am glad." "Clara, I meant what I said at the gala, and I do not take it back, but I have watched you these past weeks, and I know where a person's eyes go when they think no one is looking, and yours have never once gone to me. I will not spend my dignity chasing a woman whose heart is already spoken for. He is a lucky man, whether he knows it or not. Tell him I said the debt is finished, cleanly, for good. Be happy." Salvatore read it, and something in his weathered face softened. "He is a better man than I gave him credit for," he said. "Yes," Clara said quietly, "he is. And you chose the old one anyway," he said, and there was wonder in it, not vanity. "I did," she said. "When his wife died," Salvatore said, after a long silence, and Clara understood he was giving her something he had given no one. "I told myself that loving me had killed her, that my world is a comet, and everything it passes near, it burns. I have carried that for 10 years like a stone in my chest, and tonight you walked into the dark of that place, into the very heart of everything I am afraid of, and you walked out again, alive." Clara reached across the small table and took his hand. "Maybe," she said, "you are not a comet. Maybe you are just a man who has been telling himself a story so that he never has to be brave again." He looked at her, and the space between them seemed to grow very small, and slowly he leaned toward her, and she toward him, and after everything, after all the running and the fear and the long dark road, there was finally nothing left in the way. And then a sharp sound split the quiet, the shrill electronic wail of the house alarm triggering somewhere down the hall, and they both startled back, hearts pounding, and Salvatore was on his feet at once, every instinct awake, and Clara let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob. "Of course," she said, staring at the ceiling. "Of course." The alarm proved to be nothing, a fault in an old system tripped by the wind, but it was enough. And by the time the two of them had settled again, something had changed in Salvatore. Some old fear the night's near miss had woken, and Clara saw it in the way he would not quite meet her eyes for the rest of that night. She should have known then. In the morning he was already up before her, and there was a car waiting in the drive, and a bag by the door, and when she came into the kitchen he told her, in the flat, careful voice he used when he had already decided something and did not wish to be argued out of it, that he had made arrangements. "There is a house on the coast," he said, "far from here, far from any of this. Marco will take you there this morning, and you will be safe, and in time you will be able to build a life that has nothing to do with me or my name or the things that come with it. It is better this way, Clara. It is the only way I can be sure that what almost happened last night never happens again." Clara stood very still in the doorway, and then she laughed, a short and disbelieving sound with no joy in it at all. "So this is it," she said. "This is how you do it." He would not look at her. "I am trying to protect you." "No," Clara said, and her voice rose now, all the fear and grief of the past days pouring out of her at once. "No, you are not. You are doing the one thing you swore to me you would never do again. You are running. You ran from me on the porch the first night. You ran when Dante brought his flowers. For 3 whole days you hid across that field. You walked out of the gala without a word rather than stay and fight for me. And now, when I have crossed everything to reach you, you have packed a bag and called it love." He turned to her at last, his face tight with pain. "Because everything I love, I lose," he said. "Because my whole life is a list of graves, and I cannot add yours to it. Do you understand what it would do to me?" "Then say it," Clara said, and she was crying now, but she did not stop. "Say the thing you are so afraid of. You call it protecting me. But do you know what it is? To the girl who spent her whole childhood sitting by a window with a packed bag, waiting for a man who always had a reason to go. Do you know what your protection feels like from where I am standing? It feels exactly like being left. Every single time. You have found the kindest possible words for it, but it is the same door closing that I have watched close my entire life, and I will not stand at another window and watch another man decide it is better for me if he disappears." Salvatore stood frozen, and she could see the words landing in him, one after another, because there was no exaggeration in them and he knew it. "It's easier for you to put me in that car than to admit you want me to stay," she said, quieter now and more merciless for it. "It's easier to hand me a house on the coast than to risk loving something you might lose. So go on, send me away, but do not you dare call it my safety. Call it what it is. Call it fear." For a long moment he said nothing, and the car idled in the drive, and the whole gray morning seemed to hold its breath. "I don't know how to do this," he finally said, and his voice broke on it. "I have not let myself want anything in 10 years. "Then stop wanting to be safe," Clara said, "and stop deciding my life for me. And for once in your stubborn life, just say it." He opened his mouth, and nothing came, and Clara let out a sound of pure exasperation and threw up her hands. "My God," she said, "marry me then. Just marry me, you stubborn old man, because I am in love with you and you are in love with me, and I am done, I am finished, waiting by windows for men who are too much of a coward to admit it." The driver in the car very carefully looked away. Salvatore stared at her, and then something in his face gave way entirely, and he crossed the space between them and took her face in his hands the way he had almost done a dozen times before, and this time nothing on earth interrupted him. "I love you," he said. "There, I love you. I have loved you since you carried the heavy crates yourself and would not let me help." And then he kissed her, and the bag stayed by the door, and the car in the drive waited, and was finally sent away empty. In the weeks that followed, the family set its own house in order, as such families always have, quietly and without the involvement of any court. What Vincent had done could not be forgiven, for he had reached into the family's sealed records and sold his own brother to their oldest enemies, had built a forged chain out of a dead man's debt and a grieving woman's loneliness, all so that he might finally sit in the chair he had coveted his whole life. Marco gathered the elders, and the truth was laid before them in full, and Vincent was stripped of his name and his place and sent away from the family forever, cast out into a life without the protection he had spent decades trading on, which for a man like him was a punishment heavier than any other. With the traitor exposed and the old man safely returned, the Castellanos found that their long, patient scheme had collapsed entirely, their inside man gone, their leverage broken, their reach into Moretti territory cut clean, and they withdrew to lick their wounds and count their losses, and the threat that had hung over the vineyard since the night of the watcher in the trees was, at last, lifted. Dante came north one final time to deliver the papers that confirmed Clara's father's debt was closed for good. Every false figure struck out, the real and modest remainder quietly forgiven by Marco as a matter of honor. He shook Salvatore's hand at the door and told him plainly that he had done the family a service and expected nothing for it, and to Clara he only smiled and said that he had met someone in the city, a doctor, kind and steady, and that he thought perhaps he was finally learning to want the sort of quiet life he had always claimed to be too busy for. "He is a good man," Clara said, watching his car disappear down the gravel drive. "He is," Salvatore agreed. "And he had the good sense to lose gracefully, which is more than I can say for most men I have known." It was in the midst of all this settling that Clara's health, which she had waved off for weeks, refused to be waved off any longer. The dizziness that had caught her at the window returned, and the mornings grew difficult, and at last Salvatore, who had once double-checked the doctors of his dying wife until they begged him to stop, would not hear another word of her excuses, and drove her to the city himself, and sat gripping the arms of the chair in the waiting room like a man awaiting sentence. When the doctor called them in, his face was unreadable, and he said he had two things to tell them, and Salvatore's hand found Clara's and held it. The first, the doctor said, is that the symptoms you have been having, the fatigue, the dizziness, the sickness in the mornings, are nothing to be afraid of. And the second, he said, turning the paper toward them with the beginnings of a smile, is that they are not an illness at all. You are going to have a child. The room went very still. Clara brought her hand to her mouth. Salvatore did not move for a long moment, and then, very carefully, he sat down in the chair beside her as though his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him. "A child," he repeated. "At my age, a child. You are going to be a father," Clara said, and a laugh broke out of her, wet and astonished. "Say something. I spent this whole month certain I was dying, and I am not dying, I am," and she could not finish, because she was crying and laughing at once, and Salvatore reached out and gathered her against him and pressed his face into her hair, and this man who had counted graves for 10 years, who had been so sure his world could only take and never give, wept for the second time in Clara's presence, though these were nothing at all like the first tears. That night, on the porch where all of it had begun, beneath the same pale lamp, Salvatore told her that he was finished, truly and finished, that whatever small thread still tied him to the old world would be cut, every one, that his name would mean nothing but grapes and honey from this day forward. "I have spent my life in a world that made me believe love was a thing you buried," he said. "I am done with that world. I am going to grow old, and I am going to be a father, and I am going to be here." He looked at her. "I am going to stay." Marco came to the vineyard on a bright, cold afternoon not long after, and he found Clara alone among the vines, pruning back the spent canes for the winter, and he stood watching her work for a while before he spoke. "I owe you something," he said at last, and the words came stiffly, the way words come to a proud man who is not accustomed to offering them. "When you came to my door that morning, I called you a great many things in my head that I will not repeat. I was certain you were what my uncle said you were, and instead you were the only one who believed my father was worth finding, and you walked into that place when my own people told you to stay in the car." He looked at the ground, and then at her. "I did not trust you. I told you as much. I was wrong." Clara set down her shears and wiped her hands on her coat. "You had every reason not to trust me," she said. "I was a stranger with a debt, appearing out of nowhere in your father's life. If I had been you, I would have thought the worst of me too." Marco almost smiled at that. "My mother," he said, and his voice changed, grew quieter, "would not have wanted him to spend the rest of his days alone. I knew that, even when I was angry. I think what frightened me was not that he had found someone, it was that he seemed happy, and I had spent 10 years believing he had forgotten how." He looked out over the rows of vines his father tended now with his own hands. "I do not know you," he said, "but I would like to, and I have come to say that I am glad it is you." That was as much as a man like Marco could give, and Clara understood the size of it, and she took the hand he offered, and something between them that had been closed since the beginning eased open at last. When Salvatore came out from the house and found the two of them standing together among the vines, his son and the woman he loved, he stopped where he was, and Clara saw his throat work, and neither man said anything, because they were both the kind of men who did not. But Marco crossed to his father and embraced him, and Salvatore held his son the way he had not let himself in years. The wedding, when it came, was a small one, held among the vines on a mild afternoon in early spring, the first green just returning to the canes. There were no chandeliers and no long tables of quiet money, only a modest gathering of the few people who truly mattered, and the seamstress from town, who had made the blue gown, wept openly through the whole thing and refused to apologize for it. Clara wore a simple dress that the same seamstress had let out gently at the waist. for by now there was no hiding the child, and Salvatore stood at the end of the row in a plain suit and watched her walk toward him through his own vineyard, and Marco, standing beside his father as his witness, leaned in and muttered, "Do not start crying, old man. You will set the seamstress off again." And Salvatore muttered back that he would cry if he pleased. It was his wedding, and both of them were lying, because both of them already were. The vows they spoke were plain. Salvatore promised in a voice that carried across the quiet vines that he was finished running, that for whatever years he had left he would be exactly where she could find him, that she would never once have to sit by a window and wait for him to come home, because he would already be there. And Clara, laughing through her tears, promised to remind him of that promise every single day, and to cross any field, any darkness, any distance, to reach him whenever he forgot. And when the small gathering applauded, and the old man kissed his young wife among the grapevines he had come here to grow old beside, the vineyard that had seen so much grief that autumn held instead, for one afternoon, nothing but light. The years passed the way good years do, quietly and without anyone noticing how many of them had gone, and the old farm at the edge of Galena that had once seen a watcher in its tree line became a place full of small running feet and laughter. The house that had held 10 years of silence now held noise from dawn until dusk, and the sealed room at the end of the hall had long since been opened, its curtains drawn back to let the light in, for Salvatore had learned that honoring the dead did not mean living like one. 2 children grew up among the grapevines, a boy who had been given the name of Clara's father, so that the name might at last belong to a man who kept his promises, and a girl who carried the name of Isabella, because Clara had insisted upon it, saying that the woman whose letter had freed her husband to love again deserved to have her name spoken with joy in that house, rather than only with grief. Salvatore, well past 70 now, moved a little slower among the vines than he once had, but he was there every morning all the same, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, teaching small stubborn hands how to tie back a heavy cane without bruising the fruit. And in the afternoons, he sat on the porch beneath the same pale lamp where it had all begun, and watched his family move through the rows of green, and he could no longer quite remember the man who had once been so certain that his world could bring nothing but ruin to the people he loved. One evening, as the light went gold across the vineyard and one of the children shouted for him to come and see something wonderful in the far row, Clara came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her the way he had learned, at long last, to do without fear. "To think," he said quietly, "that I once told you I would have married you if I were a different man." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "And what do you know now?" she asked, "that you did not know then?" He was quiet for a moment, watching his children run through the vines he had come here to grow old beside. "That it was never about being a different man," he said. "It was never the age, or the past, or the things I had done. It was only ever whether I dared to stay. Everything I feared came from believing I could keep the ones I loved safe by leaving them. And it was you who taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is not to run, but to remain, to be there in the morning, and the next morning, and every morning after." Clara smiled, and she did not answer, because there was nothing that needed answering, and together they watched the sun go down over the vineyard and the children they had made, an old man, and the young woman who had refused to let him disappear, both of them exactly where they had always wanted to be, which was simply and finally beside each other. And if this story has touched your heart in any way, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to leave a like and a share, so that these stories can continue to reach others who need to hear them, and so that you can be here with us for every new one we tell. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please share your thoughts in the comments below, for there is nothing that means more to us than hearing what stirred in your heart as you listened. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We wish every single one of you who has watched all the way to the end good health, a life full of quiet joy, and peaceful, gentle days ahead. Until we meet again in the next story, take good care of yourselves, and goodbye.